sort of ability to take advantage of that by Beijing is too late. You know, the Chinese have been trying to push for what, a 2-child, even 3-child policy in the past 10 years, and it's not really been taken up by many Chinese, particularly the new money that's coming in with the middle class and such. Is that sustainable? Could you unpack that a little bit more for me?
That they had this huge demographic dividend starting in the early 1980s, I think, and then 70s, up to now. But it is petering out, and of course it's not sustainable. Policymakers in China, I don't know if they're aware of it, if they take it into account with their geopolitical moves, like, hey, should we do it now? Because now we still have this demographic dividend. I hope not. But they focus on the wrong solution to the bubble mostly, although I think sort of the stimulus that they announced was necessary. And we do, on the monetary side, so they, lowering interest rates, all of that stuff, not a solution to the underlying problem.
This is The Global Gambit.
So economics, it is ubiquitous with politics. It is ubiquitous, I think, whenever countries go to the polls, which has been more than any other time this year in history. Economics is often the most prevailing motivator as to whether or not people vote in a certain way or they vote in another way. With an ever looming US election in, just under 2 weeks exactly at the time of recording, economics is certainly on the minds of many. But interestingly, the IMF came out and said that the US is doing quite well and has actually upgraded its forecast for both this year and next year. The only advanced economy or OECD member to be to receive such an accolade. But yeah, economics, it's something that a lot of people have opinions about, but they don't necessarily understand. But someone who does understand is Joeri Schasfoort. And I think I might have said his name correctly. I don't know. He'll probably correct me at some point. But I'm delighted to have Joeri because he is the host of Money and Macro, which is arguably my favorite. I think it is my favorite economics more focused channel on YouTube for one specific reason. He actually knows what he's talking about. There's plenty of channels that like to, say that, we'll talk about economics, but they either dumb it down too much or just talk crap. And Joeri doesn't do that. He actually talks with substance. And we've been arranging this conversation for a while, and I'm delighted to finally be bringing together a bit more of the economics. As you know, on this show, we try to bring in the nexus of geopolitics and economics, blend them together, because talking about them in isolation is not really a true representation of how the world economy and political systems work. But Joeri, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you?
Thank you, and thank you very much for that kind introduction of being arguably perhaps your favorite economics channel. I'll take that. I'm good. Thank you so much for inviting me, Piotr.
No, sure. And I say that sort of tongue in cheek because I don't really know that many economics channels, but you're one of the ones that I do watch religiously. I'm quite selective of channels that I have always, ringing the bell, notified whenever they release a new video. And that's a dropping hint, people. If you're watching, you should subscribe and do that as well, right? But you've got a PhD from the University of Groningen, and I probably said that wrong as well. But that's my English attempt at foreign languages. You cover a lot of things. And I think my initial question really for you in this, we're probably going to split this into two parts. The first part being a bit more about the global sort of macro output, and then we'll focus more on BRICS at the moment at the summit is happening, and then China, because you cover a lot of China. How do you approach economics on YouTube, if that makes sense? Because there are a lot of channels that sort of they just make a very dumb attempt to make it sound as though it's all black and white, and you break it down, and you've done a couple of reaction channels videos, which I found hilarious as well as informative. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your personal approach to teaching and explaining economics to people on social media.
Yeah, so my approach is very sort of inspired by my background. So as you mentioned, I started doing my PhD at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands in macroeconomics and financial economics. I was really, a modeler, making all these macroeconomic models, so very much into the technical side of economics. However, for me, academia was often too theoretical and too much focused on formalities like mathematics or statistics, and not enough on what's happening in the real world. And so what I'm really trying to do on YouTube is to combine the best of both worlds. So to read all the time academic research in economics, but preferably empirical work. So looking at data and trends, and also combining that with economic theories, and then sort of applying, that knowledge, my background there, to what I'm seeing in the world today. So very much, I try to release an episode of Money and Macro. I try to teach a little bit of economics to people, but always have it be applied to what's going on in the economy today. So, I could cover, and that means that I cover a very wide range of subjects, China's economy, Europe's economy, but also sort of more general macro trends. I just released a video on the rise of solar power, where, I don't go into the technical stuff. I purely try to keep, going from my area of expertise, that is economics. So if I talk about solar, I talk about the investment dynamics between the adoption of solar. If I talk about the impact of sanctions on Russia, I don't take the geopolitical angle too much, although, as you mentioned, the two are, of course, connected. But I always try to, have the economic angle and leave sort of the other angle to other channels.
No, that's very astute, and I think that, I think both the FT, S&P Global, JP Morgan, lots of, should we say, financial institutions and sort of political risk entities have, repeated this year that geopolitics seems to be the biggest risk to various financial assets and people interested in those areas. So I think but I appreciate you taking that deliberate attempt to sort of isolate it somewhat and focus on it in its own self, because otherwise it can get a little bit blurred, like me maybe trying to blur it altogether. But I guess my follow-up question is, though, we are living in unprecedented times, in the sense that the broader macroeconomic structures are really being tested from various things, be it natural disasters, what's happened in, obviously, America with the hurricanes in the past couple of weeks, but also sustained conflict. And I suppose, how do you, as an economist, look at this? How do you approach where to focus? Do you focus just largely on the biggest economies, or do you try to nail down a little bit more into the niche and micro factors as well? Be it, specifically in, I don't know, Southeast Asia, for example, or Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm just curious how you sort of choose to break down things into different segments.
So I definitely focus on the major economies because they have such a huge influence on everyone else, right? So let's, monetary economics is a big part of what I tend to focus on. Okay, and if we look at monetary economics, the dollar is obviously the world currency. What happens with the dollar affects everyone, ranging from Southeast Asia to Africa to China to Russia, and of course to the United States itself. So I definitely focus on the major economic hubs a lot. Like if you look at manufacturing, for example, all over the world, you really see that there are basically three places where this takes place: East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Europe, and the United States, Mexico, Canada, right? So I of course focus a lot on those because I want to keep people up to date about what's going on in the global economy. But that being said, if something happens that's interesting or relevant in a small economy, I'll deviate and cover that for sure. So, for example, 1 or 2 years ago, there was a major crisis in Sri Lanka. Then I'll cover and do a deep dive into what's happening in Sri Lanka, because the lessons there are very relevant for all other economies as well, right? Before Sri Lanka, we had a major crisis in Lebanon, for example. I'm currently doing a big analysis on the Israeli economy, because the lessons there are relevant for the world, I think, as well.
No, for sure. I mean, Lebanon's unfortunately a classic case of a country that suffered a shock event in that explosion in Beirut in 2020, and the country's never really recovered. But I think what I'm interested in a little bit, if we sort of actually get into more of the thematics of it, is that, the world has, since 2008, obviously it's not one singular event that causes it, but 2008, we've seen a growing shift away from globalization, a rejection of sort of neoliberalist policies. And in that time, we've seen a growing sort of audaciousness amongst sort of middle powers or other countries that want to challenge the prevailing Western-led economic system. And so Do you think that that is happening at the moment? As I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, the IMF has revised its projections about the US economy, but everyone's always talking about how badly the US economy or the GOP is or the MAGA. So, when you look at things from a very, very macro perspective, should we have cause for optimism or continued sort of skepticism about the, next few years or short to medium term?
Yeah, so what you're mentioning with the end of globalization is definitely one of the big trends in macroeconomics that I'm tracking. The IMF calls it fragmentation because it's basically that the world is fragmenting into these different blocks that are not trading less amongst each other. So Canada and Europe, for example, are not trading less, right? But you have these blocks that are trading less. So the sort of the Russia-China block, or at least the Russia-Iran block, is trading far less now with the Western bloc, for example, right? And so, and what we've seen, if we look at sort of trade, the trend of trade, we've definitely seen, like if you look all the way back, we've seen these massive sort of moves over time. Like, for example, before the First World War, we had the first wave, so-called first wave of globalization, trade as a percentage of GDP in the world going up. Then the interwar years going down. Then during the Bretton Woods system from 1945 to about the 70s, we saw it inching up a little bit. And then this massive explosion, similar to, I think, one of the names there is a neoliberal growth era ushered in by Thatcher and Reagan. And now we've seen it stabilize. So far, I don't think you can actually say it has deglobalized. We've seen it stabilize. I've seen the IMF call that slowbalization. But it's definitely one of the major trends that I'm tracking, and I don't think I think it will continue in the sense that these, if you look back historically, these trends take decades. We've now entered probably a new trend. I think it will definitely continue.
Yes, when I was doing my master's at SAIS, or Johns Hopkins in DC, one of the things I became very fascinated was with globalization theory. I mean, what did you call it? Slowalization or something. We've got glocalization. Slowbalization. Sorry, my bad. I completely forgot the yet another acronym they've made up. Goodness me. Gradualization, maybe that's an actual word already. But I think what's interesting for me is that as globalization is experiencing this shift, there was a very good book I read last year by a professor at the Council on Foreign Relations called Shannon O'Neill, I believe. It was called The Globalization Myth. And it was this whole idea that sort of globalization in its purest form that we've always thought of has never really existed, that countries have always really operated predominantly on a regionalization basis. As you said, you've got different blocks. It's just how much they're intertwined with one another. And it's sort of a spectrum as to whether or not we've really had a pure sense of globalization. Do you think that there's some truth to that? And this whole idea of decoupling from China by the US and reshoring, friendshoring by the Biden administration, are these realistic sort of reversal policies, or are they just a natural trend that's happening because of the broader sort of, growing protectionist attitudes that a lot of countries have?
I don't really, I don't really see the conflict between those two. Like, are they useful policies, or are they part of the trend? I think, or are they policies that can work, and they can be part of a trend, right? I definitely think it's part of a trend. I'm not entirely sure what the argument is of the professor, I think that you're quoting, that you've always had this sort of regionalization. I think, if we like the metric that I use for globalization is look at total imports plus exports and divide that over global GDP. And then you can clearly see very big moves. So I would argue that that is a real thing. Of course, that could all be very regional. Perhaps that's what you're saying, like the trade is very regional. And it is, of course, true that most trade is regional. If, for example, you look at European economies, they are very open. But if you then sort of only look at them, trading outside of Europe, then all of a sudden Europe is still a fairly closed off economy. So I think that regionalization effect is absolutely very important. But if you look back at the first wave of globalization, for example, I have this old bond which sometimes inspires me. It's of the Russian railroads in the late 19th century.
Oh,
And
really?
then if you
Oh,
look at the
interesting.
back, it says, hey, you can get the payments for this bond collected at this bank in Amsterdam, this bank in New York, this bank in Moscow, this bank in London. And this was late 19th century. I think if you look back at the era of deglobalization, sort of that followed during the interwar years, I suspect that was more difficult to actually do that, especially if you look at sort of the geopolitical rivalries, right? And this is something that we're now possibly seeing again. Of course, not yet, or not yet with China, but with Russia, it's actually, I think, been quite spectacular, sort of how decoupled, at least in a financial sense, they've gotten from the Western world, in the sense that a lot of their trade is now denominated in Chinese yuan. So yeah, I think you can say deglobalization or fragmentation is real.
I certainly think fragmentation. I think what Shannon's emphasis is that sort of regionalization was the predominant trend over the past 40 years, not necessarily economics, because there's also a difference between in being international but not necessarily being global, right? You can be an internationalist in that you believe in international cooperation, but that can still mean you have a desire to incorporate some protectionist policies for certain domestic industries or something. And I think her emphasis is that whilst MNCs and multinational corporations and ideas and money did obviously go abroad, they didn't necessarily go to the furthest corner of the globe from their domestic home nation. They stayed close to home. I also appreciate you talking about the different ways of globalization, because I think a lot of people don't understand that this isn't a singular occurrence, right? We had it during the arms race or the ship race, the naval race between the British and German empires in the early start of the 20th century. That was a huge driver of economic growth for both countries and broader regions. And then there was a slowdown in the interwar periods, as you saw, and then we saw a pick up again after the Second World War. But this time, globalization and sort of the broader economic sphere is different, predominantly because of technological advancements, right? Do you think it's going to continue? Is globalization unstoppable, as hyperglobalists argue, or do you think that we are entering more of a regional fragmentation, and that's going to be the sustained period for the next few years?
It's really tricky, because I think it depends so much on what will happen sort of with China specifically, because China is just so big, right? And there, I think, geopolitics would come in. And there also sort of my expertise ends a little bit, in the sense that, for example, we've seen that Russia's economy has really decoupled in important areas, not everywhere, from the West after they invaded Ukraine, right? And that's, something that an economist like me, or famously, for example, economists at the European Central Bank, who thought inflation was going down, they couldn't foresee that Russia would invade Ukraine. Neither could I. I think, what will happen to fragmentation depends for a very big part on whether or not China will invade Taiwan. So, and that is very much, I think, even for geopolitical experts, unpredictable, right? So, yeah, if nothing big happens,
it's a tough question, I know.
I would expect fragmentation to continue, at least for quite a couple of more years, and the reason is that I think in China, the signals that I'm getting is that the leadership there is very much embracing the idea that China should be able to produce everything in the world. And that is simply not acceptable, I think, to the rest of the world, because they don't want to get dependent on everything, for everything on China, because they've seen, for example, just recently what happens, after Europe got very dependent on Russia for something very crucial, such as energy. And one of the stories I've been covering on my channel a lot is sort of the global reaction to, the Chinese economy is slowing down due to a huge the bust of their housing bubble, basically. Mm-hmm. So demand in China is slowing down by a lot. But at the same time, the government is not, saying let's stimulate demand. They're saying let's stimulate supply. And so you have a lot of supply coming out of China, but not a lot of demand. So obviously, exports as a share of GDP from China, is creeping up, even though you cannot always see it in the data. But the customs data from China is not as reliable as it used to be, and it never was completely reliable. So I see sort of in China that the incentives, so maybe this is sort of where I can come in as an economist. I often look at what the incentives are. So
Okay.
based on the policy that there is, are pointing towards more fragmentation. But if something like an invasion of Taiwan happens, you could see a major shift into huge. I would not be. I really hope this doesn't happen. I wouldn't be able to predict the economic fallout because it's just such a big event, right? Um, but if that doesn't happen, I would expect fragmentation to definitely continue, but not hopefully nothing like the interwar years, because perhaps as you mentioned, technology is progressing in the other direction. More and more people are starting to speak the same language, English. And so between blocks, you could even see on a global scale that there is fragmentation or deglobalization, and yet between blocks, trade continues to become more important. That could very well be the case.
I think what I'm curious a little bit, I mean, on the Taiwan thing, I talk about that a lot. It's one of the areas I focused on. And, a lot of people put 2027 as the year where the Chinese might try to launch some kind of operation. I'm not going to pretend exactly what or how, but this sort of, Xi's not getting any younger. Obtaining or sort of reincorporating Taiwan back into China as part of national rejuvenation is sort of a cornerstone of his legacy, if he wants to be sort of put on the same level as Mao Zedong or something. But on the Chinese thing, I don't want to focus on China a little bit too much because that's part two, and we got to humor it. But from what I understand, Xi's been resisting calls to intervene in the economy for a while, and Beijing has suddenly decided to make a U-turn with its approach to the fiscal stimulus. So I think it's going to be a challenge for him because he's not an economist. He's an ideologue in many ways. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but do you think China is going to face it's facing economic headwinds and things are going to get a lot worse? Do you think?
So I definitely, I mean, it's a fact that he's not an economist, and it increasingly looks like he's not listening to economists either, or at least not the economists that typically tend to advise, as I would, that if there is a recession like China is facing now, then demand is a problem. He's everything points at him, except for a few sort of measures that don't really do much, like saying, "Oh, we should consume more, but not giving households more income." But so the rest, all points to him focusing way more on supply. So I would say that is a very big headwind for China's economy, and it's very similar. Like many people, of course, talk about how similar it is to the situation that Japan faced after their bubble popped. But there are also some big tailwinds for China, right? So I think they did strike gold when they focused on solar energy or renewables and electric vehicles a few years back with their industrial policy, really setting the tone for international industrial policy for what we're seeing now. And the strength that they're showing there is really remarkable. That the pace that so I've just released a video about how solar energy is sort of going exponential on a global scale, but most of that exponential growth actually comes from China. If you take China out of the picture, growth of solar capacity in the world is rising, but more flat. Can we predict how that will affect their economy? They will still have the demand side problem for sure, but yeah, it's and they cannot export their way out of trouble. I think they're too big for that. But that is still a major sort of tailwind, I think, for China at the moment. That they are becoming more efficient. They are embracing new technologies faster than the United States and Europe in crucial sectors. And something not talked about a lot, I think, or talked about even in the opposite way of what I'm just going to say, demographics. So many people love to talk about the terrible demographics that China has, right? And it's hard to deny that they're facing a huge demographic decline in the upcoming century. But what not many people talk about, I think, is the economic concept of the demographic dividend, meaning that sort of the idea there being it's good to have a larger working age population. And of course, you can say, well, if people are getting older, your working age population as a share of the population overall is declining, right? So it's a bad thing. But you also have to look at the other side of the distribution. And if fertility falls by a lot, then you can have this small moment in time where the working age population as a share of the overall population is actually going up because people are not having children anymore, and so now all of a sudden you have a lot of young people in China, or young-ish people in China, that don't have a child to take care of, and hence they can work more, right? Or that's basically it. So I've recently seen this very interesting paper sort of coming out of the university where I did my PhD, Groningen, by Professor Stefan Brackmann, for example, where they have plotted the demographic dividend of various countries and continents, and there the US and Europe are facing a demographic headwind for the foreseeable future. China is still facing a demographic tailwind for the upcoming couple of years, but of course after that it will definitely be a huge demographic drag. But the upside is that maybe actually they're having a demographic tailwind still for a couple of more years, which could be is very important for demand as well. So that it's so difficult with China because we don't know the scale of the problem, right? Like if we look back at Japan's bubble, they had this huge bubble, but they didn't in prices, but they didn't have all of this massive construction that depresses house prices. So it's so difficult to actually know sort of how big the bubble is, and therefore to predict accurately, how well or how poorly China's economy will do in the upcoming years. And I've now mentioned some tailwinds that I think are not talked about enough. But that being said, I'm still relatively pessimistic because I think the size of the housing bubble was just so big.
Yeah, it's huge. I'm very interested and glad you brought in demographics actually, because that was my it's one of my areas. That's what I did one of my degrees in. And I mean the demographic dividend. I remember reading the paper by David E. Bloom in 2003 when he was talking about this, and I don't know. I feel like I'm surprised. To be honest, you surprised me when you said that you still expect a demographic dividend from China, because from my understanding, a lot of maybe demographers, not maybe economists, see it as already passed. And therefore that this sort of ability to take advantage of that by Beijing is too late. The Chinese have been trying to push for what a 2-child, even 3-child policy in the past 10 years, and it's not really been taken up by many Chinese, particularly the new money that's coming in with the middle class and such. So could you unpack a little bit more about that brief burst you mean though? Because is that sustainable for a country to depend on the dependency ratio of the population and the economy, therefore to be improved for that short time is okay, but it's still going to peter out, right? So do you not think that's, I mean, Japan has been remarkable in its sort of sustainment of its economy, but their population, I think, is forecast to decline to about 100 million by 2050 and then 45 million by the end of the century. So I don't know. Could you unpack that a little bit more for me? Because I think that's interesting, but I don't know if I fully agree with you yet. Persuade me.
Yeah. Well, look, I have to say that I depend a lot on research done by, so there's this working paper by Brackmann, Kohl, and Marwijk. Anyone who wants to look it up can just search for that, 2024, I think. And sort of, I rely on their calculations. So this is, of course, something that comes back again and again. I am the goal of my channel is to look at research, make a judgment call if I think the research is credible, and then sort of based on that make analysis. And in this case, I think I know this professor well, and I think the research is probably correct. And so, but they show sort of that they had this huge demographic dividend starting in the late or in the early 1980s, I think, and then
70s, 80s, I think, yeah.
up to now. But it is petering out. It's getting less, right? So, and of course, it's not sustainable, right? Because they project a demographic drag, so the opposite of a dividend. And that's on a scale we've never seen before. That's going to be much bigger than in Europe and America. But they just project it will start in about, I don't know, 8 to 10 years or something, just by heart. But so no, it's not sustainable. If your question is that sustainable? No, it's not. It's just me saying that this is something that people, I think, it surprised me when I read that paper. And I think it's something that people don't talk about enough. And, if we can speculate, maybe that is something that policymakers in China, I don't know if they're aware of it, if they take it into account with their geopolitical moves, like, hey, should we do it now? Because now we still have this geographic demographic dividend. I hope not. But yeah, and that being said, I'm still pessimistic because they have this huge bubble. They have, at least in 8 years, a huge demographic tailwind coming up. They focus on the wrong solution to the bubble mostly, although I think sort of the stimulus that they announced was necessary. And we do, on the monetary side, so they lowering interest rates, all of that stuff. That's not in my my argument is always that's not a solution to the underlying problem of having too much investment and not enough consumption, but it is necessary to sort of slow down a bubble popping. But fiscal stimulus is it depends more how they do it. I think like fiscal stimulus you can do in many ways, right? You can subsidize factories, then you're targeting supply, which is not in my opinion the right moves. Or you can do handouts to households, but we don't know yet. They've said, hey, we're going to do fiscal stimulus. That's also an indication that the problem is very big, probably, because they were resistant to it earlier on, right? So, hey, probably the problem is really, really big. But, I think we can only form judgment if we know what the fiscal stimulus will actually be about.
Yes, indeed. For any government to U-turn, it's not good, but certainly for the CCP and the factions within it. And I think Xi has surrounded himself with a lot predominantly of yes-men. But on that point, and for more on China, you have to join us in part 2 and part 1. See you later, guys.